Hey, thanks for coming tonight, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing somebody that I met tonight. Now, the fun thing is, I've been reading his books for a little while now, and I feel like I've known him for a few years now. He tells me he's been writing for 13 years, which makes me feel better because I thought it was a lot longer than that. So I was glad to hear I wasn't quite so old when I started reading. So Todd has been a former lawyer. He's been writing for, like I said, 13 years. He lives in Minnesota, Minneapolis to be accurate. He's got 2 kids, 1 granddaughter, awesome. And this is actually his first venture into historical books. He does have 3 other books. They are all more contemporary, but they are, this one is historical, is Regency England. And if you haven't read it yet, make sure you get it ordered tonight because it is fantastic. So thank you all for coming tonight and seeing Todd. We really glad you showed up. And I'm going to turn this over to Todd. He's got a great presentation about his writing and the time period he wrote in. So thank you, Todd.
Thank you. Am I good to go? Sounds like I'm good to go. Thank you. Well, good evening. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate Baker inviting me to this event, and very pleased that we were able to come here in person. My wife is here with us tonight. This is my son. My daughter is with us, not only in spirit, but also through the wonders of technology, is also joining in the event as well from home in Minneapolis. I want to say that I'm thrilled not only because it's always because, well, fundamentally, authors love only one thing more than finishing a book, and that's having an opportunity to talk about it. So you've given me that opportunity, and I know that there have been some wonderful authors up here to present before. So thanks once more. The topic was left up to me, as you stated somewhat correctly. I'm going to be doing some readings from the book. For those particularly who haven't read the book, I'm also going to be talking about the process for developing and writing this book, as well as some of the history of the period, and then with some notes about of encouragement to people who are would-be authors or maybe starting off and trying making their best efforts to become an author. I'll say that because I was given a wide open field, I initially was going to talk about the University of Michigan's football prospects this year. I also considered talking about my gardening skills, all rejected by my wife. So I'm going to settle back then to the more typical topic, which is my most recent book, which is The Barrister and the Letter of Mark. Well, let me begin by taking this down. There we go. First of all, I want to explain to anybody here who does not know, even what really doesn't really know what the title signifies. I want to explain what it is. A barrister is the English version of a trial attorney. I'm sure everybody's seen this image or something like it. In the United States, an attorney can do pretty much anything that a lawyer would do, whether it's writing wills, writing contracts, or stepping into the courtroom and serving in front of a judge. That's not true in the English system, so it's not true in Great Britain, it's not true in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, any of the countries that developed out of the English system. In those countries, you have a barrister. The barrister is an attorney specifically trained to be in the courtroom, to present cases, to do trials, conduct trials. The solicitor is basically the attorney that does everything else. They prepare contracts, wills, and so on. And the solicitor also, importantly, refers cases to the barristers. The barrister isn't out there, with their face on billboards like you see in the United States. They have to receive their case from one of the solicitors. That's the source of their business and their revenue. So that's what a barrister is and was in the time of this book. But this system has been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. A letter of marque is another unique thing that most Americans will not have heard of. So a letter of marque specifically is a device in the nature of a document, which is signed by the king or queen in the case of England, but they're used in countries throughout the world, and in fact are embodied in the United States Constitution. the power to issue letters of marque. A letter of marque is basically kind of a stay out of prison free card. It is issued to privateers, in other words, owners of private vessels. It embodies in them then, or it embodies rather the power to take ships of other countries as though you were a member of the military or the navy of the issuing country. So, and you can do so without fear of being deemed a pirate, which you would otherwise be deemed because you're a private vessel. And letters of marque have been used going back to the 14th century in England. This particular letter of marque is significant because, and I'll be talking about this later, this one is the actual copy of one that was issued in 1695 to Captain Kidd. We'll talk about Captain Kidd later. But in any event, therefore, the barrister in the letter of marque is a barrister who's involved in a case with respect to a letter of marque. So let me be more specific. The year of this book is 1818. I'll talk about that period in the future here. It's 1818, and here's where England is at this moment in time. England has been engaged in a war for over 20 years with Napoleon, with the French, and it has been not only a difficult war, but it's also been a disastrous one economically. England has won this war, but they've done so using up their coffers. They are out of funds. That's true of the crown, that's true of the parliament and the government, and it's certainly true of the people. And the people are all, for that reason, are under heavy tariffs and heavy taxes as the country and the crown tries to regenerate their coffers. Yeah, the year 18, the war had ended in 1850 with the Battle of Waterloo or soon thereafter, and now it is 1818. What has happened in this book is that a woman who is an estate owner, Lady Madeline Jameson, owns an estate outside of London. And Lady Jameson, her estate is faltering because of these taxes and tariffs, which was not uncommon at the time. Lady Jameson buys a boat. She buys a brigantine, which is a fairly large size merchant vessel. And she's done so by borrowing money from two sources, a solicitor, her family's a solicitor, and an American smuggler, who she's been introduced to. She's done this to try to get out of the terrible economic straits that she is in. She has purchased the ship, which was called the Paget, and the captain of the ship is going to be Captain Harry Tuttle, who is her cousin, with whom she is quite close. Harold Tuttle needs additional funds, and so goes out and seeks investors. He needs funds to be able to acquire goods abroad to then bring back to the English harbors and to sell for the profit. In this case, he does so. In this case, though, however, he's approached by two investors. The investors remain anonymous. They approach him through a solicitor, and they proceed to offer him not money, but they say that they can obtain a letter of marque signed by the king at that time. And that means that this privateer can go out and basically obtain goods merely by taking them from other vessels. So that is accepted by Harold, and he sails off. And he's successful in capturing a French cargo of tea, and he returns with that cargo back to England. He sails up the Thames in February of 1818, lands triumphantly, and is immediately constables and soldiers of the crown board the ship, stating that he has been a pirate. He goes to his cabin to recover the letter of marque to prove that he is no pirate, but acting under authority of the crown, and the letter of marque has disappeared. It's disappeared within the hour between the time when he last looked at it and the time that he is now being arrested for the crime of piracy. And piracy in that time was a capital offense. Lady Jameson then sets out to find a barrister capable of defending her cousin. And she knows she's up against some very, very powerful enemies because her cousin disappears soon after the landing. You can't even find what prison he is in. And it becomes clear to her that somebody is very deliberately trying to wreak havoc on her and on her estate and on her cousin, Captain Tuttle. With that backdrop, I was going to read a few sections, short sections of the barrister letter of marque. I'm going to start with something that's a little bit unusual, I imagine, for these kinds of events, and that is what I'm about to read to you does not actually appear in the book. That's because it's what is called a cut. It is a section of the book that I originally had written and intended to have a part of this book, laying out some of the history of the protagonist, who is the barrister, whose name is William Snopes. But I decided to cut it out and use a different section. This section still, though, is demonstrative of who William Snopes is. And so I wanted to read that to you. This takes place in the winter of 1803. Again, remember, the book is taking place in 1818. So this is when Barrister Snopes has just become a barrister, and he's approximately age 22. So this is the winter of 1803 in Stirling Council, Scotland. 24-year-old William Snopes looked up and down the snow-shrouded street. His face had long since grown into stiff clumps of flesh, his hands and feet cold beyond feeling. His lips scarcely obeyed him. Exhaling a thick cloud of moisture, he squinted through frosted eyelashes. There it was. The tiny house he'd been told was the midwife's, nestled between a rendering store and an undertaker. It seemed a grim arrangement, but then this was the poorest stretch of a small town which prosperity had long since fled. That is, if it had ever graced the place at all. Stomping his feet, he examined the house cautiously. After searching dozens of villages and towns, this had to be it. It fit all the connections he had traced. It was the endpoint of every rumor. It was a kind of place which would have suited his father, who was surely intent on making as hidden a corner of the world as possible for his deed. Yes, this had to be the place. Besides, he surmised dismally, he spent nearly his last dollar. He couldn't afford to be wrong again, any more than his heart could bear another failure. To gird for disappointment, William began a low hum of the tempestuous strings of Mozart's masterpiece, La Finta. He exhaled, then he shuffled stiffly across the road to knock. A long moment passed before the door swung open, revealing a shriveled woman wrapped as though her home offered no more warmth than the street. She demanded hoarsely of William in a language he did not understand. "I'm sorry," he replied. I don't speak Gaelic, only English." She looked him up and down. "What does he want?" "You're a midwife, aren't you?" She scrutinized him further. "Yes." "I'm searching for information about a young woman. I believe you assisted her with the birth of her child. It was 6 years ago, but I'm hoping you'll still recall her." More caution flattened her face. "I'm old," she croaked. "My hands have birthed many children. 6 years ago? That would be impossible to remember." "Please, it's very cold. May I come in to discuss it?" More hesitation. Then the woman reluctantly stepped back. William followed her inside. Entering a tiny sitting room, William glanced about. The furniture was sparse and aged. A thin log burned on a hearth, scattering little warmth. Through another door, he saw a shelf with stacked cloths, bottled powders, and a large cloth bag, a midwife's tools. She gestured for William to sit at one of the 2 chairs in the sitting room. To his discomfort, she remained standing, covering him with her silent stare. William shivered as he warmed a bit. "The young girl," he began, "was named Mary Blangan. She was from Wiltshire County, the only child of a tenant farm family. She had long blonde hair, a warm smile, a gentle heart. She was also a very bright girl, you see, especially for her upbringing." She stopped, realizing he was wandering far from any helpful information. Besides, the old woman wasn't showing any interest. "The man who brought her was tall," he added. "He was over 40 years of age then, quite strong." The old woman's eyes remained fixed and unwavering. "I learned of a farm family outside this town who owed my father money," he said, "a debt which he forgave about the time that Mary, age 16, would have come to you. It was very strange because, you see, my father never forgave debts." Silence. William's mind drifted to the Blangan's farm on his father's estate. Always tidy and well managed. A small farm of modest means, family of modest means, buoyed by a strong faith and a great joy at their only child. Not that his father would have noticed. He had cared little for such details about his tenants. They were entries in his books, distinguished as either profitable or not, until Mary Blingan had grown old enough to come to his attention, so soon after William's mother had gone to her grave. My father would have paid you well for your services, William said, and I believe you would remember it. He could be very cruel if he didn't get things he wanted. William placed a hand, still stiff from the cold, into his jacket and pulled out a modest bag of coins that he set on a table. Whatever he paid you for your silence, this is all I have to compensate you for breaking that silence, along with my promise to not convey the information to anyone else. The woman's gaze took in the bag of coins, but she didn't reach for it. Feeling the first pangs of desperation, William shook his head. Mary's parents were shorn of all happiness at her departure and have refused my every request for information about their vanished daughter. All these years as I've struggled through my barrister apprenticeship, I've used every spare moment, every spare shilling to try to learn where Mary might have been sent for the birth. The Denner family outside of the town that I mentioned, they've refused to speak with me, which leaves only you, the local midwife. Won't you please put my journey to rest? Won't you tell me where Mary and her child have gone? The midwife's eyes closed. Dawson, do you think this is a story I've heard only once? She said softly. You seek help that I cannot give. William looked to the meager fire, his heart beginning to chill once more. This had to be the midwife who birthed Mary's child. Every fiber of his barrister's heart said it. Every crumb of intuition that his senior and mentor touted in William cried out that it was true. Yet now he saw, as he should have realized even before making this long trip, that he had no tools to compel her to speak. This was no courtroom where he could channel a magistrate's power or apply his fresh barrister skills to wrench free the information he so desperately longed for. His search was at a fruitless end. The chair scraped the floor as William wearily pushed back to stand. He looked at the ancient woman once more, then about at her scant shelter. Keep the coin, he said. His hand was on the door when the woman rasped, "What is this girl to thee?" He turned slowly. My father fathered her child, so Mary's child would be my half and only sibling. I wish to know them, mother and child, and I feel responsible for what my family did to Mary and her family. The man you speak of, your father, was he truly so hard? Yes. The woman let out a sigh. I remember such a man. He had no wish that the child would be born. He wished for another service. And you know Mary? His heart quickened. I knew someone who might be her. Where is she? Where can I find her? The girl you're Mary, if it is she, the old woman went on. You will find her in the churchyard, 2 streets to the north. I would not do as the man demanded. But when the date of birth came, the child was twisted in the womb. I couldn't save the mother. And the baby he managed through the thickening of his throat. A girl. I was told she was sent away by the young woman's parents to America. They feared for her. You mean they feared my father. The midwife didn't respond. Then they were beyond his reach now, Mary and the child. William went out the door. Snow was falling again. He scarcely noticed. His chest was as empty as his pockets as he began the long return journey to London. I wanted to read 2 other segments of the story. It's not giving away a terrible amount to say that William Snopes eventually accepts the case that's brought to him by Lady Jameson. Lady Jameson has her role to play because they're having terrible difficulty proving the existence of this letter of marque, which is what they must do in order to save the captain. But that's not the only problem that Lady Jameson is struggling with. In addition, she has the lenders, whom she has to deal with, one of whom is the American, the smuggler. At this point in the book, Lady Jameson is moving into the city to help prepare for the trial with barrister William Snopes. She's getting in her carriage to drive. And before she does so, she wants to stop in town, a small town, this is adjacent to her estate, and talk to her very good friend, a woman who was like a second mother to her, the chemist's wife in this small town of Staunton. She wants to stop by and have a last word with her before going on to London. And she's preparing to get into the carriage to be driven by her servant Davidson. Davidson entered the dining room with the air of calm that Madeline had known her entire life. The carriage is ready, my lady. Madeline took a deep breath, sorely tempted to delay leaving the only home she'd ever known. Before her return, the manor house could vanish from her life. The loss of the pageant could make it so. The solicitor from whom she borrowed the money, a portion of the money, could seize the grounds to repay the loan. The prosecutor could come for her and her father as conspirators to the piracy they were charging against her cousin. It all made parting both perilous and sorrowful. The carriage took the drive to the road under low-gathering clouds threatening snow. A single horse was tied to follow. In the interior, Madeline pulled her scarf closer. Passing fields and woods she explored since she could walk, her thoughts wandered to possibilities she did not want to consider. She was still staring when the staccato bumps beneath the carriage awoke her to the wooden bridge in the town. Davidson halted the carriage before the chemist shop, where Lady Jamison got out and went inside. The shop was empty. Neither customers nor Roisin nor her husband were to be seen. Madeline took a moment before calling out, "Roisin?" All was quiet. Had she gone shopping? She usually left a sign on the door. Madeline considered leaving, but badly wanted to speak with Roisin to ask if she had any contact with the American. She stepped around the counter to the door leading to the preparation room in the back. In the center of the back room, Roisin stood frozen. An apron wrapped her thick body. Her hands were white with powder. Her eyes were wide. "Go away, Maddie," she hissed. Before Madeline could move, a man stepped from the dark of the pantry closet. "Lady Jamison," the American said, in a clipped Yankee accent that Madeline so disliked. "You were the chief topic of our conversation." "Leave her be," Roisin commanded. "I told you I'm speaking for the lady." "Is she now?" the American asked Madeline. "Is the chemist's wife your agent now? As I remember, Roisin here negotiated your loan arrangement, our loan arrangement, but the money all went directly to you." She remembered the man vividly, though they'd met only once, on the chilled sand on the seashore at Crispin's Point. Staring at him now, fear engulfed her. She wanted only to say yes and walk away, but she couldn't. She wouldn't leave Roisin this way. "No," Madeline managed. "I'll speak for myself." "Good. That makes things much easier." The American stepped around Roisin to face her. "I learned that your ship is docked in London Harbor. Where's my money?" They'd spoken only briefly when the gold was delivered, dragged from a dinghy onto the shore as the smuggler's schooner rocked at anchor 100 yards offshore from the point. He tried to intimidate her then by standing close, testing to see if she was afraid of him. It had worked. She'd been unable to hide her fear. And he intimidated her here now just as much. His voice seemed like a storm piling onto rocks. His smile thinly concealed an air of brutality. Except she had even fewer choices now than she did then. And fear was no longer such a stranger. And she knew she needed to draw closer to the man, not shy away if she was to convince him to extend the loan. "If I'm to do business with you directly," she said, "I must know your name." The American's stare hardened. For an instant, he thought he might strike her. "Only my crew and my friends know my name." "Does Roisin know it?" He nodded. "She's a friend, and she knows how to keep her mouth shut." "She's my friend too, and she'll tell you I also know how to keep a secret." The dark smiled again. "All right, it's your hanging if I ever learn you spilled it. My name's Grayson Turner. Now tell me why I don't have my money." "You know why I haven't the money, Mr. Turner," she answered as boldly as she could manage. "Your sources will have told you." He took in her face. "Yes, I do know. Then tell me what we're going to do about it." "I'm sure Roisin has already told you what I could do. I'll need another 3 months. And I'm to accept this why? I'll pay you £200 now The loan was 50 times that amount. Then there's the interest. It's what I can give you. You'll get the rest of your money with the interest when we sell the Paget's cargo. If you sell the cargo. From what I've heard, that's not guaranteed. We will. If we fail, you can keep the Paget. I don't need a brig, my lady. I need my money. And if you fail, I doubt they'll let me keep her anyway. I'll add 5% to the interest on the loan. Reaching behind his back, the American pulled a pistol from his belt. Maybe I should just go back to your house and start taking my repayment in goods now. My lady said 5%, sir. The American turned. Davidson stood in the frame of the back doorway. Madeline's father's brown best musket was in his hands, level with the American's chest. The American slowly lowered his hand with the pistol. Just who are you? He's my servant, Madeline answered, relief and gratitude flooding her. She looked to the smuggler. Davidson can retrieve the 200 pounds now. That and an additional 10% interest from this point forward for forbearance. The American shook his head, giving a sigh. That'll buy you one more month. The problem with your ship should be settled by then, but if you lose your brig and cargo, Lady Jameson, there'll be hell to pay, servant or not. I'll be back in 2 hours for the call. And one last reading. As the case goes forward, the barrister is having great difficulties getting the evidence pulled together. In fact, his case seems to be worsening as time goes on. He's trying to keep up the spirits of Captain Todd, who is still in prison at Newgate Prison. I'll talk about that in a little bit here, just a few minutes. But he's doing his best, but it's very hard, and the captain is rapidly losing some strength. But the next day, the captain is to speak or to go to the witness stand. So William was preparing him in his prison cell. He'll do very well, he said. The captain looked immune to encouragement. We're losing, aren't we? William gave his best smile. Not based on today's evidence. Captain, please understand, we've only barely begun. The first day has cleared the throat. We have at least 2 more days and much to say on the topic of your innocence. Please, sir, don't lie to a man on the eve of his death. If only he could reassure the captain, buried all these weeks in the depths of this ungodly place, he would shout a certain victory in his best advocate's voice. But how could he make such an unsupportable promise without losing credibility just on the eve of the captain's testimony? Instead, William overcame his natural reticence and reached through the bars to grip the captain's shoulders. Harold, lies are unnatural things. Bad ones fall apart like sodden paper. Good ones are hard to conjure and wearying to sustain. I don't know why someone is expending such energy to perpetuate their lies about you in the letter of Mark. But I've learned in my practice that all falsehoods fail in the end. The challenge is ensuring they do so in the time of our need. I'm doing everything in my power to achieve that in the courtroom. All I ask is that you stay faithful just for a few days more. Captain Tuttle looked to the cell floor at his feet. If lies are so unnatural, then remind me what truth is in this world, Mr. Snopes, and how it can be hidden so. I've forgotten. Father Thomas will tell you from his profession that it's God's most fundamental trait, William answered, the essence of who he is. In the courtroom, truth is tool and brick, powerful to wield, and the only foundation for true justice. Anyone telling you otherwise is a liar, a modern narcissist, or self-deluded. So, I'd like to spend a few moments explaining how I came to write this book. Before this time, these were pictures I was intending to display to you. But you're going to have to ignore, they're great. In any case, this is actually a picture of the inside of the prison that I was just reading about. But we'll come back to that in a moment. These are the 3 books that I wrote prior to the current book. All of these are contemporary legal thrillers. But as my family can tell you, my love of history is just about as strong as my love of writing. And so, although these were great deal of fun to write. And these first two were actually based upon actual cases that I was engaged in. Nevertheless, I wanted to see if I could do something that would engage both my love of writing and history. And I set out to figure out what I would like to write about. And I've always found England to be a very, very interesting, particularly 19th century England, to be a very interesting place and time. Not only in historically, but also in literature. Like one of my great loves is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. I love Dickens. I also happen to like works that have been done on television and elsewhere that engage English barristers. Now, one television show I used to love was Rumford of the Bailey. All that kind of came together and fairly quickly in the character of William Snopes. William Snopes has characteristics of each of these people I've mentioned, Dickens characters in general, Sherlock Holmes and so forth. He's also very much himself, has his own place. He's an individual who respects the law, knows the law quite well, is quite clever at it, but also views the law, and I've known many lawyers that view the law this way, and I think myself as well, as still as a tool. Is to be respected, is to be followed, but if it has to be stretched a little bit to get to the truth, so be it. If you can do so well, you're that much better at a trial attorney. And that's the nature of William Snopes. So I had my lead character, and soon after came Lady Jameson. I wanted a very strong woman. In the period I was looking at in the 1800s, it's hard to find places where women could exercise that kind of strength under the law and otherwise. But Lady Jameson was fairly quickly constructed. And then I took those characters and they took me to try to find the right place for the story. And I settled on Regency period England. Now, Regency period England, Regency period England is a very interesting time in English history. So after the Revolutionary War, which, as we all know, the British lost, the King George III was having a great deal of difficulty. He was increasingly unstable. They'd have to kind of step in and hide his presence for a time because of the fact that he was unable to make decisions. And that reached a peak in 1811 where his instability was complete. He was unable to continue to serve as king. So the question was, what did they do? Because this was an unprecedented event. And they decided to have his son, who was also named George, this is King George III I'm talking about, his son George, who later became King George IV, step into his place. And he did so in 1811. And he remained as the ruling king effectively till 1820, regent. So he stepped into the king's place. His title is now regent of the king, and he becomes king in his own right in 1820. And people talk about the Regency period as that 9 to 10 year period, but really most people actually say, oh, it extended 10 years either way beyond that because of all of the events that were happening that were unique to that period. And the unique things that were happening were very interesting, and that's why I wanted to place the book in this time frame. There were extraordinary changes in the arts, particularly music, but now the other arts in architecture and urban planning. It was a time when there was a great change in the societal norms and expectations. And a lot of that, the latter, got embodied in changes in the law. And it's extraordinary what happened with respect to the law. During a period of about 15 years, between 1825 and 1840, 4 major acts were enacted in England. And think of how earth-shaking any of these would be. Think of all 4 of them coming into fruition. One of them was the end of slavery. The British ended slavery in the empire as of I think it was 1832. They also passed the first law limiting child labor. The initial stab at it may not sound as exciting or as revolutionary as you might think. Chimney sweeps who were able to perform practice down to the age of 8, they were raised to the age of 12, which was a step in the right direction. But ultimately, by 1840, they raised that to age 16. But there were other laws related to labor and cruelty to employees. There was the Catholic emancipation. The Catholic Church had been under a great deal of attack in England following the War of the Roses. And at this point in time, there was a full emancipation of the Catholic Church. There was also the Reform Act of 1832, which started to develop some support for the poor, recognizing the need for it. Perhaps the most important thing for the book I was writing was something called the Prisoners' Counsel Act. For the first time, individuals were allowed to have attorneys represent them in their defense. They had been allowed to do it with respect to misdemeanors and high crimes, but strangely not for felonies. And part of this arose out of the fact that there was a very strong belief that the most important thing in a jury trial was for the jury to see the face and the conduct and the demeanor of the defendant. In the courtrooms at the time, they would have sound bars hung over the dock, especially in the Old Bailey, we'll talk about momentarily, which would reflect the sound so the jurors could hear. But they also had a mirror hung so that they had full light coming out of the windows on the face of the defendant. The notion that you did not have to testify in your own defense was not a part of the English system. The thought was the most important proof that you could look at for deciding whether or not an individual was guilty was the look on their face as they testified about the events. So this was now said you could have a defense counsel step up and advocate in these felony trials was an enormous change in the right direction. So now I have my characters. I have Regency period London. And then the question is, what is the story? Kind of important. There, in fact, was I showed you the letter of marque previously. That was the letter of marque for Captain Kidd. Captain Kidd was an interesting figure in history. He went out, as letter of marque implies, much the way Captain Tuttle did in my book. And he set out, in fact, took a French ship in the Indian Sea under this letter of marque and brought it back. And he brought it back to England in a roundabout fashion. He landed and was arrested. And he was arrested for piracy and for murder relating to one of his crewmen. He protested that he had a letter of marque. He didn't claim to have a copy of it. He said, go check in the Admiralty offices. And they did. They said, we can't find it. There were some very powerful interests at the time that because there was some question about the practice of this particular ship's captain and the cargo they had taken. So some people say his investors kind of faded into the back. Maybe even the king might have been part of it. But in any event, they couldn't find his letter of marque, and he was convicted, and he was hung. His letter of marque, though, the reason you're able to see it is because it was found in the archives of the Admiralty Office in the 1920s, roughly 300 years too late. But that was the inception of this book. Now, with those tools, those ideas at hand, I set out, did a great deal of research, a lot of books. One particularly wonderful book was this one, Some Experiences of a Barrister's Life. It's considered a World Heritage book, nonfiction, which he describes his practice in the English courts from roughly the 1830s to the 1880s. And got a lot of PhD theses, and the result is this book. I'd like to spend just a minute showing a couple of pictures that you think you might find interesting. You'll find if you read this book that I did a great deal of research on the buildings at the time and on the streets and the maps in London that I was able to acquire. But many of the buildings still exist, or at least we have photographs of them because they existed long into the 19th century. This is actually the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey is a courthouse that's been standing and operating since at least the 1500s. And it's been changed in many respects, that's why I say at least, but it still operates to this day. It's a central criminal court in central London. Next door to the Old Bailey was Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison was terrible, a terrible prison. Plague, they had actually a disease that they named after Newgate Prison because how often it would come with waves. Adjacent to it, you can't see it here, was the Old Bailey, so it was very convenient to take prisoners from the prison, the courts, and if afterwards, if they were convicted, either bring them back to prison. They weren't very often kept in prison here very long. They were either executed, which was quite common, or they would be what was called transported. They would be sent by ship to Australia or New Zealand to serve out their sentence and to serve out the rest of their lives. So I've read to you some portions of the book. I've described how the book came into being. And I wanted to spend just a few minutes about a couple of points, but then a few minutes to aspiring writers. I want to, this is kind of off the track of what I've been talking about, but I've just got to say something about it. I was fortunate that this book was the first of my books that was turned into an audio book and audible. They didn't tell me they were going to do that, but I was happily surprised, pleased. So the book was produced, and that's the first time as soon as I learned it was there, you can imagine I got it, and I listened to it, and I loved it. And I didn't love it because I'm just that deeply in love with my own prose. I loved it because the person that got to read it was an actor named Samuel Roken. Samuel Roken was one of the stars of the TV show The Turn. If you've seen that, it's a Revolutionary War piece for 4 years, and Samuel did a remarkable job. I just got to mention him because of that. He did every voice. He'd have voices, an American, an Irish, and it sounds like a joke, and a priest in the room. He'd get all their voices, and he just beautifully. And what it did for me is I realized when you're writing something like this, you're trying to create 3 dimensions on this thing. You're trying to create a world and trying to populate it with people that are real to people, and you do that with words. And for the first time, I think I gained a great deal of respect for people who can take those words and dramatize them and really bring them into the three dimensions. I found Samuel Orkin's website, and I sent off an email to him thanking him. And he came back to me within about an hour and said he enjoyed the book. Thank you for the warm words. And I'm also excited to say that when this was set up for this talk tonight, he liked it. so I can hope that he's somewhere out there listening to me praising him, hoping that he reads my next book. Finally, then, I wanted to say something about to aspiring writers. You know, I started writing when I was in elementary school, 4th and 5th grade. And then I did it through junior high school. Wherever I could, I used fiction, writing short stories to complete assignments in school. I did some in college, and then I set it aside because I was coached, probably properly so, that get a job and then you can write on the side. I set it aside so I could go to college, and there it remained for year after year. For year after year, I would say to myself, next year I'm going to write that novel. I really wanted to write novels. Kept going, and I realized when I got towards my late 40s, early 50s that space is starting to run down in terms of my writing this novel. And so I started to write, and I sent some of my writings over to a publisher at Bethany House, who was a friend. And I said, what do you think about this? I wasn't suggesting that he should publish it. I really wasn't trying to backdoor it. I really wanted his advice. He passed it on to an editor. And to my surprise, the editor, through my friend, not directly, got back to me. And he said, do you have any ideas for books? He said, we don't publish the kind of stuff you wrote here, this book you started. Do you have any other ideas? I said, yeah, I've got ideas. And I sent him 10 ideas for books. And he came back to me again through my friend. And this is weeks. It's almost like Pony Express. It's going so slowly, but it's always through my friend. And he said, give me 20 pages on this one idea called the deposit slip. So I did. I got him 20 pages. Got back a little while later, and I says, okay, give me 20 more pages. And I did. At this point, he said, have other people read it. I asked my wife to read it. Her response was, it's pretty pedestrian, Todd. So I wrote it better. I worked on it. She didn't hesitate to knock me down a notch. I continued this process with this editor through my friend for a year. And finally, I got another communication, and the editor said, Todd, give me 20 more pages. We're up to about 100 pages now. He said, give me 20 more pages. He said, get back to me in 4 months. Make it the best you can do. I wrote back and said, I'm on it, but I can have it back to you in a couple of weeks. And he came back pretty fast this time. He said, you're not listening. So I want 4 months because I want this to be the very best you can do. And so I marshaled my wife to read it. I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I got those remaining pages. And for the first time, I got an email directly from this editor. His name is David Long. And David said, let's have lunch. And we had lunch. And there was my dream come true. About halfway through lunch, he said, Todd, we're going to publish your book. He said, and I said, when do you want it? He said, when it's done. I said, what does that mean? He said, Todd, the hardest thing for any novelist is to finish the book. So you get it to me when it's done and when it's good. Okay. Now I share that because when I got to that place, which is tremendous, I'm not sharing it. This is a very unusual circumstance to get a book published this way. And I know that. And I'm not sharing this to kind of rub it in people's noses who have not had that kind of good fortune to not even have to find an agent. The reason I'm sharing this is because when I came to that moment, I looked back and I thought, why did I do this earlier? And I figured out that the reason I hadn't done it earlier was because in my head, I thought to become a writer, I had to first sit down and knock out a great American novel. And then when that was done, I'd go out to and find an agent, which was also going to be terribly hard to do. Then I'm going to climb the next mountain, which is find someone to publish the book. And when all that is done and it's out, I'm a writer. And I realized that when I finally did start writing, as I did leading up to the publication, that the reason I was able to turn the corner is I started to say to myself, I was a writer the minute I put a word down on paper. And that led to everything else, that I had to put a word down on paper. And then that word became a sentence, that sentence became a paragraph, and then a chapter, and lo and behold, I had a book. And if nobody else, other than my long-suffering family, actually read that book, it didn't matter because I was a writer when I put down the first words on the page. And that's what freed me up to begin writing. So that's why this can become this if you just let yourself write. And one last note, the first thing you write isn't going to be the best thing you're going to write. You just got to keep writing. By the time I finished the deposit slip, the last chapters were far better than the early chapters. And I had to go back and edit. And you're going to find that's true, I think, through your entire career. You're taking it seriously. So I just want to extend that encouragement to future writers. Thanks.
Stay up there, but we've had a very busy online audience for questions tonight. So the first one we got was the scene, the deleted scene. This is what they said, okay? So I'm just going to read it. It says, the scene you read was great, and I agree with that. How did you feel when it got cut? And did you cut it, or did the editor cut it?
I cut it. I cut it. I want out if the person reading the book will see that the similar information is provided to the reader in the first chapter that I left in the book. It starts earlier when he's 18 years old. I got a little bit deeper into who he is, but I decided to cut that and leave the other. And frankly, I'm thinking that cut chapter may not be cut for long. It may be part. I'm hoping to write. I'm actually working on the next serial, so I hope I can be that.
Oh, good. That answers a couple questions here. One of them is, will there be another book with these characters or and a different case, which is interesting. So, and then what are you working on next? Well,
I'm working on two things at once. So I wrote a book while I was waiting to publish the Barrister book. I wrote a book on another historic novel based on Ernest Hemingway and his last years in Cuba, and the notion that he basically discovers the missiles aimed at America before the American intelligence services do so, but is restrained from informing them because of a young girl he's befriended whose life would be at risk if he reveals the information. So I finished that book, and it's awaiting going out to the marketplace. But I'm also working, so that's really in an editing phase, but I'm also working on the next book, hopefully to follow this one. And the notion is, again, as I mentioned about all the changes in the law that were going on during this time, there was one other that I didn't talk about, and that was a woman's right to divorce. So between 1700 and 1850, I would challenge anybody here to correctly guess how many divorces occurred in England. There were a total of 34 in that 150-year period. Why? Because divorces could only be granted at that time with an act of parliament. Now, how many of those 34 do you think were granted to women? And I'll tell you, there were 3. So you can tell that women didn't have a very great opportunity to divorce. And men could, typically divorces were only granted for adultery. Unusual cruelty to women was not sufficient to get a divorce. And one major case in the 1830s was so heinous that finally Parliament had to look at changing the law. It took another 12 years to really get it changed, but they did. So this book is going to be still back in the same time frame, shortly after this. And the notion of the book is so far as I have it to date, is that a man is seeking a divorce from his wife. There's another thing. If If a man marries the wife, all of her property and the children become his. And if they divorce, that remains so no matter what the origin was of the property. So this man has married her and now is trying to divorce her and will take, of course, the children and the estate. And William Stokes takes her case, basically fighting it first in Parliament and then in the courts, with seeking his own divorce on her behalf. So that's the one.
Yay. Somebody would like to know, are you gonna write more historical, which you kind of answered there, but are you gonna return to contemporary? Or would you be interested in a time slip?
Time slip?
Yeah, the dual times.
Oh, I've never even thought about that. That's interesting. Tell them to send specific ideas to my website.
Okay, whoever sent that question in, you heard him.
I would be interested, as I said, as I've practiced the law as a trial attorney, and I'm still actually practicing, although I'm coming here to the end. I've done it for more decades than I care to admit, as I shared with you before. It's pretty much second nature. I've lived through decades of change, and it's not hard for me to come up with ideas for books. I've had I've got to say, it's been a unique, rewarding career, representing everybody from radiation victims out in Washington, which is what the critical reaction is about, to the deposit slip, which is a real case, to all manner of other cases. I've got to say, though, it was so fun writing the barrister that I think I'm going to be working on the historical genre for a while now.
And I'm kind of okay with that. So, somebody wants to know, how long does it take you to write a novel?
Well, as a full-time attorney, it's taken me, it depends on the book, but it's taken me anywhere from 2 to 3 years per book. And that's when as I say, I'm nearing retirement. I've switched my 95% law, 5% writing to the opposite in the last 3 months, 4 months. My goal is to write a book a year or even in 9 months. But for me, and I don't know how other writers do this, and I know everybody's got their method, but I find that when I'm done with the book, I'm kind of exhausted of what I feel like are good ideas, And so I don't want to just sit down and just start writing until and I find if I just let it sit, kind of simmer for even just a couple of months, ideas start to kind of bubble up. I think, what about that? What if this happened? And then out of that, eventually I get enough of a skeleton of a story that I'm ready to write. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it in 9 months. But frankly, my sense is that readers want, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, I think you'd write your great novel, and 6 years later, here I come again. I think most readers, if you want to have a base of readers that are loyal to you, want to see a book every 6 months to a year. So that's kind of part of the deal. I'm going to try to meet that expectation.
Great, you're okay with that too. We like this. Somebody asked if with historical fiction, do you do all the research and then write the book, or do you research as you write along?
Well, I do a lot of research, or I did a lot of research before I started to write. I felt like I had to understand the Regency period before I could really start. But once you start, of course, new ideas are coming to you, and this is one of the wonders of modern technology. I'll be writing along, and I'll realize this character is going to come. Like in this situation that I just read about, where the servant comes to the rescue of Lady Madeline Jameson with a brown, I call it what it was, brown Bess musket. Okay. I had to figure out, okay, I knew the servant was going to come to a rescue, but what kind of guns did they have? Did they have muskets? What kind of muskets did they have? How close did he have to be? And that stuff takes research. Just to get the brigantine that I showed up here to understand how much tea they could get through the letter of marque and how much it was worth. I had to research the economics at the time. I had to translate crowns and shillings and the modern monetary costs. I had to figure out how much a whole brigantine could hold. So long story short, yes, you do a bunch of fundamental research, but you're constantly having issues come out as you're writing. That's my experience.
Interesting. So, and then one last question here. Somebody asked, what books are you reading now?
I'm reading this great novel called The Barrister and the Letter of Marque. Can't put it down. I just literally.
Order that from me.
I'm reading one more book I read or just finished. It's actually written by my son, who's in the audience today, which is a wonderful book that I definitely recommend, called The Faustian Bargain. origins of World War II. I do read a lot of nonfiction, and I'm trying to actually have it be in the genre now so that it is both for enjoyment, but also propels my ability to write these books. But I still have a great little fiction. One other thing I'm also doing is I've been really blessed on this book, particularly this book, with a lot of writers in the historic genre. Jocelyn Green, gosh, I'm blanking out, but I've had a bunch of writers who have come forward and have, supported me. They've taken my book and they put it in their space on their websites. They've liked it. They've written blurbs. I got some wonderful blurbs back here from Jocelyn Green, from Rachel McMillan, from Rosanna White. And I hadn't read their books before, frankly, because I hadn't been in this genre. So I'm trying to catch up. I'm finding I'm loving their books. I'm learning from doing it, and so I'm trying to do that as well.
Anybody else have a question? Well, thank you very much. That was very informative. I'm looking forward to the book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which will be fascinating. But the sequel to this one, I really enjoyed those characters and got to know them. So I'm excited to hear about book number 2.
Thank you for having me here.
And you're very welcome, and you're welcome back anytime. So, and thank you everybody for joining us online and here in the store. We really appreciate it. Again, if you haven't gotten your copy, go to bakerbookhouse.com and order a copy today. And shortly we'll have pre-orders on the next one. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you soon.